It's pretty wild to think that back in, 1992, even before the internet really took over our lives, people were already talking about identity wars.
Yeah.
Fareed Zakaria, the journalist, he said, the identity wars are not over. Indeed, the next phase may be worse.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing that now, after everything, it really makes you pause, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How we define ourselves, how we define others, it's just powerful and potentially dangerous.
Absolutely. That quote, it's a really potent way into what we're exploring today. We've been looking at this source that really digs into identity.
Right.
Not just as a buzzword, but, this complex mix of history, society, politics, culture, especially looking at the Arab world, but also how it connects globally.
Because it's so easy to just think of identity as, fixed, a label you slap on someone.
Exactly.
But this source says right away, it's not like that at all. It's fluid, it's shaped by all these different things around us.
Precisely. The source really stresses that if you want to get identity, you need to see how it changes, how the demands around it shift.
Especially after big events.
Yeah, like the fall of the Berlin Wall or, globalization picking up speed. It totally challenges that idea of a simple fixed identity.
Okay, so let's get into it. How does the source actually define identity? What's the core idea?
Well, it paints this picture of identity as being really layered, almost like geological strata, layers built up over time.
Okay.
Layers from history of where you're from geographically, the culture you grew up in, the social structures. It's not just one thing.
Right.
And it shows up in different ways depending on the society. And this multiplicity, it can bring people together, shared values and all that. But it can also be a flashpoint for conflict.
That makes total sense. A shared language can create bonds, sure, but different dialects or interpretations that can divide. The source also mentioned something about the Industrial Revolution shaping how we saw identity.
It did, yeah. The industrial model, with its pretty clear class lines, the whole struggle for fair wages and resources, that really cemented an idea of identity based on where you stood economically. Working class, owner class, that kind of thing. People identified strongly with that.
So you had this strong class identity.
Yeah.
Then, boom, Berlin Wall falls, globalization takes off.
Yeah.
How does the source say things shifted then? What became the main identity driver?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting according to the source. With those old Cold War blocks weakening and the world feeling smaller,
Yeah.
other identities kind of surged forward. Things like ethnic ties, cultural background, national feeling. They often became much more central to how people saw themselves and, their place in the world.
And that had big consequences.
Huge effects all over. The Balkans fragmenting, complex stuff happening in the Arab world. The source even points to the Rwandan genocide as just a tragic example of how powerful and how horribly manipulated these identity conflicts can become.
Gosh, it's sobering how these huge global shifts hit people on such a personal group level. Okay, so if identity is this layered thing, what are the actual building blocks, the components?
The source kind of breaks them down into two types. Objective and subjective elements.
Objective, like things you can measure.
Sort of. Things we can often point to. Shared language, a connection to a place, a common history or narrative about history, ethnicity, religion, or even just a feeling you share a destiny. They're often tangible, things you can grasp.
Okay, tangible things.
Yeah.
And the subjective side, what's that about?
That's more about the internal stuff. Feelings, interpretations, the feeling of belonging to a group.
Right.
The active work groups do to build and strengthen that shared identity, maybe through stories, symbols, maybe even downplaying differences inside the group. And also, crucially, resisting identities that feel like they're being pushed on you from outside by other groups or maybe the state.
So it's not just the language, the land, but also the feeling of connection and how you define yourselves against or with others. And conflict happens when those definitions clash.
Exactly. The source suggests that the struggle often kicks off when a group says no to an identity being forced on them, or when they feel like their own core identity elements are under threat. It's about, the agency to say who you are.
And there's some ground rules for this. The source mentions an ethical angle.
Yes, absolutely. That's important. The source stresses that the best, most constructive ways of expressing identity are rooted in ethical values, like a sense of right and wrong, a commitment to justice, equality, basic human rights. That ethical foundation is sort of the guide for navigating identity in a way that helps society rather than hurts it.
Okay, so we've got the building blocks, the ethics.
Yeah.
But we still see so much identity-based conflict. Why? How does the source explain that gap?
Well, the argument is that the danger really ramps up when one single aspect of identity gets blown way out of proportion. When it overshadows everything else, like if ethnicity or religion or nationality becomes the only thing that defines us, it almost automatically leads to pushing out, or worse, person-suiting anyone who doesn't fit that narrow box.
Yeah.
History's full of examples, unfortunately.
The source uses that phrase, tyranny of the majority. That sounds pretty relevant here.
Definitely. In this context, it means when the dominant group in a society basically uses its power to force its identity, its culture, its values onto minority groups.
So minorities get squeezed out.
Yeah, their identities get suppressed, their rights might be denied, they feel alienated, treated unfairly. It's like the majority's identity becomes the only one that counts in the eyes of the state or society.
Yugoslavia comes up in the source, right? The ethnic violence there.
Yeah,
That's a terrifying example of rigid identity politics.
absolutely.
And Lebanon's civil war, too, even earlier.
Exactly. Those are really stark warnings, aren't they? About what happens when identity becomes this rigid, exclusionary weapon. The deep ethnic and religious divides in Yugoslavia, the awful war in Lebanon. They both show how failing to make space for diverse identities can just lead to catastrophe.
Now, the source contrasts this with Europe and the idea of cultural diversity there. What's the difference it highlights?
Well, in Europe, the model, or maybe the ideal, has often been about integrating minority groups into the wider society. But, and this is key, at least in theory, while respecting and letting them keep their unique cultural identities.
So, more like a mosaic than a melting pot.
Kind of, yeah. Building multicultural societies where different groups can live side by side, contribute, without being forced to completely melt into one single dominant culture.
But the source also says that melting pot idea in Europe hasn't perfectly worked out, that it
Yes.
led to some other issues.
That's right. The feeling that the melting pot didn't quite deliver, the hope that different groups would just seamlessly blend, that's led to differences becoming more visible again.
And the source mentions something called white particularism.
Yeah, or a stronger focus on white identity in some places. The source suggests this might be partly a reaction to more immigration and diversity. It's not always about exclusion, necessarily, but maybe a feeling among some of wanting to reassert a specific cultural background.
And this focus on specific identities, ethnic, cultural, sometimes weakens the connection to national citizenship. Is that what this source says?
Exactly. It observes this trend where people sometimes prioritize those ethnic or cultural or religious ties over their identity as, say, a citizen of France or Germany.
Which could cause friction.
Yeah, tension between the rights and duties of being a citizen and the strong emotional pull of these other identities that might feel more fundamental to who you are.
Let's shift focus a bit, specifically to the Arab world. The source dives into that region too. What are the unique identity challenges there?
Well, the source argues that building a really unified national identity in many Arab countries has been particularly tough.
Why is that?
It's a complicated mix. You've got internal factors like strong tribal or family loyalties, religious diversity, big regional differences within countries.
Right.
And then you layer on top the impact of outside influences, colonialism, borders that were often drawn without much regard for the people living there. It makes forging a single national identity really difficult.
What about pan-Arabism? That was meant to create a unified identity, right? How does the source view that effort?
Pan-Arabism definitely aimed for that, a shared Arab identity across national borders. But the source suggests it ran into some pretty big hurdles.
Like what?
Like those deep local loyalties. Often, for individuals, their connection to their town, their region, their specific group just felt stronger, more real than this bigger, maybe more abstract pan-Arab idea. It's like your local roots sometimes just grip tighter than a broader national identity.
And the source also suggests that pushing for one single Arab identity sometimes had downsides for minorities within those countries.
Yes, that's a really critical point it makes. The focus on a dominant Arab identity, in some cases, meant that minority ethnic groups or religious groups felt marginalized.
Their distinct identities weren't fully recognized.
Exactly. Their cultures, their languages, their histories weren't always given the same respect or space. And that, naturally, often led to them demanding more recognition, more rights.
So the source is kind of warning against identity politics that shut people out, especially in the Arab world. What are the risks?
Yeah, it's a strong caution against identity politics based on exclusion, on denying the diversity that actually exists. The source argues it can break societies apart, lead to internal conflict.
And make things worse.
And even create situations where outside powers can step in and, exploit those divisions for their own benefit.
So what's the alternative then? What's the constructive path forward the source suggests, especially for that region?
It really pushes for recognizing and including all the different cultural pieces within Arab societies. It emphasizes building national structures that are flexible enough, broad enough, to actually value this multiplicity, instead of trying to force everyone into one single mold.
So, finding that balance again. Shared values, but also diverse expressions. That seems like a recurring theme.
Absolutely, that's central.
I agree.
The source suggests that the societies that work best, that are stable and fair, are the ones that find that common ground shared civic values, citizenship, justice. But at the same time, they acknowledge and respect all the different ways people express their culture, their ethnicity, their faith.
Because focusing only on one big identity just doesn't work.
It risks alienating huge groups of people. It ignores their real concerns, their legitimate ways of being. It's just not sustainable or just, according to the source.
So wrapping this up, the main takeaway really seems to be that identity is complex, it's dynamic, and figuring out how to handle it inclusively is absolutely vital for stable, decent societies. It's not an either situation, either national unity or diverse identities.
Exactly. It has to be both hand. The source really ends on that note. The reality is multiplicity. We all have multiple affiliations. Social harmony comes from finding ways to acknowledge that, value it, within a framework of shared respect and principles.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? As we finish this deep dive, you realize identity isn't just academic, it shapes everything. It makes you look at your own layers, where you're from, your family, your beliefs, your interests, and how they all fit together. And then you look out at the world, and you see these same dynamics everywhere, sometimes building connections, sometimes, sadly, creating deep divides.
Which leaves us with a big question for you, the listener, to think about. In this super interconnected world we live in, how do societies actually pull it off? How do they balance that need for common ground, for shared values, with the undeniable reality and importance of diverse identities? How do we foster real inclusion and stop these differences from turning into conflict? It's the challenge of our times, really.